Yes, these giant solar and wind technology installations may last only a few decades, then tear it down and start all over again. If there's enough planet left. It was becoming clear that what we have been calling green, renewable energy and industrial civilization are one and the same.
The newly released Michael Moore documentary, Planet of the Humans, has raised a lot of eyebrows as it exposes some flaws in renewable green energy claims. So it's kind of odd for a progressive like Michael Moore to be getting praise from conservatives and criticism from those who lean a little more to the left. Joining me now to talk about it from Ottawa's Tom Harris, the Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition. Hey Tom, welcome to Bridge City News.
Yeah, nice to be on, Hal.
Now anyone can watch the film for free on YouTube right now. Have you had a chance to review it? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I spent the last day and a half watching it in intervals. It's a long film. It's an amazing film, actually, incredibly well produced. And I really do recommend that people see it because there's a lot of very good points that are made in the film. But at the same time, it's fundamentally flawed. And I'd like to give you an analogy. Let's pretend that during medieval times, there was a town that they believed in dragons, okay? And they thought their village was threatened by dragons. And the mayor of the town happened to be a manufacturer of toothpicks. So he convinced the town that you could kill these dragons when they invaded by using toothpicks. Oh, well, just like in the story, you know, the emperor's new clothes, a child finally pointed out that, well, toothpicks aren't really a great weapon to use against dragons. They don't work at all. Well, in this movie, Michael Moore is the child, okay? He's saying that you can't stop the climate crisis with wind and solar power. And he's quite right that you can't have a significant effect. But he's also like the child because he believes in dragons. Two things. You see, the movie is fundamentally flawed in two ways. As I say, it's very good and people should watch it because there's lots of good stuff in it. But he thinks that we're in the midst of a climate crisis. That's number one. And of course, the data shows that we're simply not. That's, you know, a fundamental flaw. But the other thing he says is that capitalism is the root of all evil when it comes to protecting the environment. And yet, if you look at the historical record, it's the socialist countries that, in fact, have the worst environmental records. When the Soviet Union fell and we finally saw what was going on inside there, we found that, in fact, they had terrible environmental degradation. You see, when a society is wealthy enough and it's founded on free market principles, we protect the environment a lot better. So Moore, it's interesting, he's like the child in this story in that he believes in dragons. He believes that we're causing dangerous climate change, which is not founded. But also he believes that capitalism is the problem, whereas in fact, it is the solution if you compare it with other forms of government.
So the climate change movement often makes claims that renewable green energy is the only viable solution and that fossil fuels need to be replaced. But the film argues that green energy is in fact largely dependent upon fossil fuels, including solar power. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, first of all, you have to make these wind turbines and solar stations. You know, you have to make the panels and everything else. China is the biggest producer of solar panels in the world, and their environmental conditions are absolutely terrible. Okay, so when you're producing a wind turbine or a solar panel in China, China also has the biggest wind turbine company. Their environmental controls are absolutely horrible. The other point is that, so indeed, when you're making a wind turbine, in China, for example, coal is your source of electricity for a lot of the refining. But also think about it. I mean, a wind turbine only operates when the wind is operating in a certain range. If it's too slow, of course, the turbine doesn't turn. If it's too fast, they have to feather the turbine, otherwise it'll break the blades. So what happens at times when the wind turbine's not working? You need a backup. And as Robert Kennedy Jr. said himself, he said, when you're building wind turbines, you're really building natural gas stations. And you use just about as much natural gas or whatever the backup is in fossil fuels as if you just simply ran them for the main energy source. Because you think about it, if you were to drive your car down the road and drive it 60 miles an hour, then 2, then 8 miles an hour, then 100, you'd have terrible efficiency for your gas consumption. And of course, you produce a lot more pollution. The same thing with these gas plants that have to back up wind turbines. You're only using them when you need them. So they're going up and down and up and down. And so the same thing with solar too. I mean, when it's not sunny, they say, "Oh, we're going to use batteries." Well, I'd like to read to you something that's in the MIT review. They're saying here that GE recently sold the first of a new line of hybrid wind turbines that come with a battery attached. The turbine's battery can store the equivalent of less than 1 minute of the turbines operating at full power. 1 minute. But then they go on to say, but by pairing the battery with advanced wind forecasting algorithms, wind farm operators could guarantee a certain amount of power output for up to an hour.
Tom, some of the challenges of wind turbines is the fact that it does kill many birds and bats, and some studies have also shown that they also increase noise pollution.
Yes, that's exactly right. In fact, it's interesting. I was in Spain at the Conference of the Parties for the climate change event back in December. And it turns out that the Spanish Ornithological Society calculates that on average, their turbines, and they have thousands of industrial wind turbines, they kill 200 birds per year and 400 bats per year. So if you do the arithmetic, what you find out is that between 6 and 18 million, it's a very vague thing because they can't count them all, but 6 to 18 million birds and bats are killed per year in Spain alone. And if you look at the Altamont Pass in California, they've killed thousands of golden eagles since they launched that wind farm in the 1980s. And it's interesting because in the US, the wind farms kill so many birds that the government gives them a kill permit. Okay, a kill permit, which allows them to kill a certain number of endangered species. So the idea that they're environmentally friendly, I mean, that's ridiculous. Now, I'd like to read, to answer the question about wind noises, is an interesting quote here from a lady by the name of Sherry Lang. She's the CEO of the North American Platform Against Wind Power. And here's what she says about the noise. More than just audible sound, grinding, whumping, blade pass whooshes, an ever-present hum. Industrial wind turbines have a silent, below audible impact. They call that infrasound. It's not like a daily contamination or harm at work where people can go home at night for relief. With industrial wind projects literally engulfing their homes in rural areas, there's no or little escape. So, I mean, this infrasound, they just come right through the wall. It's low frequency sound. It's very, very bad for you. So nobody wants to live near a turbine like that. And of course, your property value goes right down.
Now, because wind and solar energy is not consistent, we chatted a bit about that earlier, because it's not always sunny, it's not always windy, we need something to store that energy, and that means, which you also touched on earlier, batteries. But how do we produce batteries? What are they actually made out of?
Well, the car batteries, for example, are made out of lithium ion, and lithium ion batteries, and they're made out of lithium. And you have to ask yourself, well, where does that lithium come from? Like the rare earth elements that are used in wind turbines, for example, the lithium is mostly mined in China and Africa under incredibly bad conditions. And in fact, they're often using child labor and virtually no health and safety and environmental regulations. So, yeah, you can make batteries, but as I said earlier, they give you virtually no benefit for any length of time, but they're also made under extremely bad environmental conditions.
How long do the batteries generally last, though?
Well, it's interesting. They're saying that the electric cars will last perhaps about maybe 10 years. The trouble is the batteries only last about half that long. So we're talking about 5 years, and the most optimistic estimates I saw were 10 to 15 years. But if you think about it, the typical fossil fuel powered power plant, that'll last 35 or more years, okay? Wind and solar, they typically last a couple of decades, but the batteries, they're only lasting about a decade.
You know what's interesting too is I have a friend that drives a Tesla, and he says to me, you know what? All the batteries in my car, a lot of batteries in a Tesla, I'm going to have to replace them in 5 to 7 years. That's going to be $8,000 to $10,000 to replace those batteries. There's also the economical element of it too,
Yeah.
right? Now, coal plants are actually being replaced by green energy. That's according to the documentary, and it argues that they're essentially being replaced by natural gas plants, another fossil fuel. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, exactly. And as I say, the Michael Moore movie is really important to watch because he does make a lot of really good points. A lot of his arguments are right, but he's actually founding it on the idea that we're causing dangerous climate change, and of course, capitalism is the source of all evil. So it's weird. The movie is both really good and and totally misguided. So, but I do recommend people to watch it because he looks at the real environmental costs of wind and solar power. And just like you say, you're not actually replacing anything. In many cases, you actually produce more pollution by bringing in wind power because you have to have inefficient backup plants, which, as I said earlier, actually increase your pollution.
Now, the documentary, this is quite interesting, suggests that big oil is actually funding much of the green energy movement, that they're profiting from both the fossil fuels and green energy, which is basically feeding each other.
Yeah, exactly. If you have a town and you have a need for electricity, oh, they can bring in wind turbines. That's great. Oh, but they also have to build natural gas stations. So what you find is the wind industry loves it, of course, and the fossil fuel industry loves it because they have to build the backup stations. So indeed, it's they ask point blank a number of the experts in the film, what's going on here? And they say they're lying. And that's true. In fact, they are. And as I say, the film is really exceptional the way he digs in. And as he puts it, as Michael Moore puts it, what they're doing is they're criticizing their friends. Well, they're not particularly friendly towards him right now because he's telling them the truth.
Now, biomass fuel is often touted as a renewable green energy source. Can you explain to our viewers what exactly that is and why it may not be as green as it appears?
Yeah, biomass fuel are typically things like waste wood. Okay, and that is actually a very worthwhile thing to burn, assuming you're not having to ship it for long distances. Because, typically when you've cleared a forest, you have a lot of underbrush and a lot of waste wood that can be used for biofuels. And that makes a lot of sense. If, however, you're concerned about carbon dioxide because of climate change, and personally I'm not, but if you are, you don't save anything because whether it's coal or whatever the fossil fuel is, you're obviously generating carbon dioxide. And the same thing with biomass. I mean, if you're burning wood waste, you're generating carbon dioxide. And in fact, if you use the biomass and actually ship it for too far a distance away from the source, you're actually generating more pollution than if you simply burn the biomass on site as a way of getting rid of it. The other kinds of biomass are things like animal waste. But, we have to realize that that's also very limited. I mean, in the movie, they talk about running an elephant compound with elephant dung. And in fact, they admitted when they interviewed the people who are actually looking after the elephants, that they actually couldn't even run the elephant compound itself with elephant dung because there just wasn't enough of it. And they're talking about, heating. So, biomass is actually quite useful if you're using the wood refuse. But if you're using the primary tree, as Michael Moore talks about in the film, yeah, he's quite right there. That's a big mistake. We should not be doing that.
Tom, the documentary seems to promote the idea that part of the solution is population control. Have less babies, then we don't use as much energy. But is this really a long-term appropriate solution?
Well, we have to understand, first of all, that we don't have a population explosion anymore. The forecasts originally from the UN were 11 billion people is where we would eventually peak. But now we're not even going to make 9 billion. And the reason for that is that the birth rate in countries like India and Bangladesh and China, of course, China's less than one per woman, something like zero point 0.7. The birth rate in these developing countries has really gone down as women become more educated. So, I mean, that's really good news that we don't have a population explosion anymore. The idea that we could reduce pollution by reducing people, I mean, that's really true. But at the same time, what we really want to do is increase their wealth because, there's something called the environmental Kuznets curve, where if you plot the actual income of a population versus the environmental degradation, what you find is that the degradation increases until you reach a certain income and then the pollution goes down. Because when people are wealthy enough, they care about the environment. And so that's in fact what we should be doing. We don't have to worry about population control because it's already over the population explosion. But what we do need to do is help people increase their wealth so that they actually care about the environment.
Now, any thoughts as to what degree this film will really impact the climate change battle?
I think it's going to have a very big impact. I mean, the last I looked, it was over 6 million views, and being criticized by your own friends, I mean, that's going to have a big impact. And I think what's going to happen over the next few months is that a lot more politicians are going to be quizzed on these hugely expensive, and generally inefficient and really not environmentally beneficial wind and solar projects. So my forecast is this will have a big impact.
Tom Harris, Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition, thanks for joining me today from Ottawa.
Okay, that was fun, Hal. Thank you.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless. Thanks so much for watching.